it's been a fascinating summer in terms of transfers, in terms of not just player purchases, but player sales as well. And we're going to go really in depth with the numbers here with a colleague of mine who I'm sure you will know for his years of producing this incredible work, this report, the transfer review. He himself is also a club owner at Esteve, a recent transaction for him as well. So please welcome the CEO of Primetime Sport, Esteve Calzada. Thank you, Esteve.
Thank you.
Esteve is going to do the presentation of the report, then we'll do some Q&A up here on stage, and then if you want to ask questions, there will be time for you to do so as well. Katie will hold the mic for you, and you can ask a question out loud to the rest of the room. Thank you very much. Esteve, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm happy to have the opportunity to present our report, actually for the fourth time in collaboration with Soccerex. So it's a great pleasure to be in here. And actually, when we were preparing the session with David, we were just conscious of time because there's so much content that we would love to discuss. And as we will probably fall short of time, I'm happy to have one-by-one conversations, and actually you will have access to the complete report. As you know, we've been doing football transfer review at Primetime Sport since 2009, so it's quite consolidated, and it helps when we've been doing it for so long. It helps that we can compare some of the data from one year to the other, and as you can imagine, given what happened this summer, when we look at 2009 and we look at the numbers that by then were leaving us breathless, if we would have thought that the numbers that we would see 7 or 8 years later would be 5, 6, 7 times bigger, we could not believe it. So let me take you through the main findings of the report. The structure of the report, we normally produce 2 versions, which always have a main piece, which is an analysis of what happened in the European transfer window at European level. And then we have 2 versions. One is the kind of zoom into Premier League, and the other one is the detailed analysis of La Liga. So today we are presenting exclusively here the Premier League edition. And on Friday, we will be presenting at La Liga in an event hosted by the chairman, Javier Tebas. We will be presenting, like we've been doing in the last years, the La Liga edition at La Liga headquarters. So just to take you through the way we do the report, and every time when there's something big happening, we need to sit down with the team and decide how do we account for different calculations, right? And sometimes we set up our own criteria. Sometimes we call the clubs themselves, you know, how much did Morata cost? Was it 80 million, is it said in Spain, or is it 60, as it said here? Or what do we do with Mbappé, which officially has been declared a loan, but there's an obligation to purchase. So basically, our job is to analyze what's happening. We're not the one deciding the way it's accounted, and what we really want is to take conclusions out of what we see. And I think there's a lot of conclusions that we can take from what happened this summer. So the way we've done the report, we have accounted for Mbappé as a deal taking place just now, a full transaction taking place just now. And by the way, the numbers that you will see are normally including only the base transfer fees, not the add-on quantities. So let's start with this European analysis. And again, everyone is familiar. What we like to do is to go into detail with the numbers, because the headline you will probably have heard, but some of the things that we will discuss today will probably be new to you guys. So everyone is familiar with what happened in the market this summer. So 16% up in Europe, that's 4.4 billion euros spent in new players, which is, again, a huge amount of money. And we've seen a significant growth across the board. Remember that we analyzed the top 5 European leagues. So when we look at what happened in the different leagues, Premier League up 16%. Obviously, the PSG activity or exceptional activity this summer has resulted in an incredible number from League One numbers. But then every single league, has been up dramatically versus previous years. And again, this is nice, and actually this is probably what's more interesting from a media headline standpoint. But it does not necessarily mean that everyone is just throwing away more money, or this is just not coming out of the TV right lucrative contracts, in our opinion, and we'll explain why. Another piece of information that we like to analyze is what we call polarization. And coming from Spain, when we were used to see Barcelona and Real Madrid accounting for 75, 80, 85% of the amount spent in every transfer window, when you see that this is changing, it's actually good news. So La Liga is showing the lowest percentage of polarization in terms of the transfers done by the top 4 teams in the league. Obviously, the opposite situation is in France because of this incredible activity by PSG. Premier League and Bundesliga continue to be the most even competitions with the lowest percentage of amount spent by the top teams. So when we talk about sales is when we start seeing the news here. And as I was saying before, yes, Premier League has grown 16% in investment, but we cannot forget, we have to realize that it has sold players for 832 million euros. This is the biggest amount in EPL history. And this has happened significantly across the board. So every single league, and the teams in each league, of course, have been extremely active, not just at buying players, but at also selling players. And this is what has been changing in recent years. So it's not anymore about I can buy players because I make more money from TV rights, or just because of the shareholder putting more money, because actually UEFA does not allow you to do that because of financial fair play. But now it's about trading players just like if it was another normal business stream. So when we look at the player sales, we can see that most of the players that have been bought have been financed by players being released and using that money collected to invest in players. And obviously it creates a domino effect, which we will see in a minute with some examples. So effectively, what we like to talk about when we explain, when we try to analyze the transfer activity is the net expenditure. So when we deduct the amount collected from player sales, we can see, of course, Premier League is still the driving force in Europe, but the biggest piece of news that probably are new to you guys is that the net spending in the Premier League is actually down versus last year, 6%, right? And this is something, again, it doesn't mean that the Premier League is not the strongest league anyway, but it shows that the numbers are significantly different, especially when we look at the other leagues. We can see that the net spending goes down dramatically after deducting the money collected from player sales. So we don't see those big numbers anymore, again, reflecting this point that teams are trading players, but not necessarily the players or the team that we are used to see trading players, like Benfica, Sevilla, Monaco, Porto. These are the teams that we were used to see selling players, and this is something that have started to change, as we've seen in the report. This year's top 10 is obviously very, very impacted by what happened in France, and the numbers by PSG have become the biggest amount spent by any team in any league in any transfer window ever, which is not news to anyone. So every team after that has an explanation, and as we will see later on, and this is a very interesting outcome, is the fact that and when we started to do the report, we would see always the same teams being strong buying players, but also always another set of teams, like the ones I was mentioning before, being specialists in selling players. This year, to prove this change of activity, change of mentality, we see that 5 teams in the top 10 of expenditure are also in the top 10 of sales, as we will see in a minute. So this is something that proves the fact that something is changing in football. Again, does that mean that if you spend more, you will win trophies? We'll discuss that with David later on. But what we've seen this year, it's many different teams breaking their own record of expenditure in a single transfer window. When we look at the sales, Monaco, even if they didn't do the Lemar deal, they've been, of course, very successful. One more summer, and they came up with the biggest amount collected by any team ever in a transfer window. This almost 400 million euros in income from player sales is a huge amount of money. And of course, you see Barcelona here top, even if it was not their intention to lose Neymar, but the money they collected, and we will talk about this exit clauses later on, but this money collected by the sale of Neymar, it means that they are in this top situation in Europe. But again, as I was saying before, teams like Barcelona, Real Madrid, Chelsea, Juventus, Everton, because of Lukaku, are now showing both in the top of players, teams buying and teams selling players, which is a new development. Another new development, and which we have seen this summer, is that opponent teams, even rival teams, have done deals between them. You know, in the past, you could say, or you would expect, like, I don't want to sell a player to an opponent because I'm playing him and I don't want to get an opponent stronger. This is starting not to happen anymore. So this year we've seen transfers amounting more than 500 million euros. Even if we take out the transaction of Neymar, it's still a big amount of money. And you know, PSG selling players to Juventus, Real Madrid buying players from Atletico, Liverpool buying players from Arsenal. These are things that we would not see before. And I guess the question here is whether we will ever see Barcelona and Real Madrid trading a player, right? It looks very difficult, but given these numbers, you never know what can happen. But this is, again, something which is new. So players trading has become a common practice. And as a top team, you need to have players in your squad that you can trade. And this is something that we will discuss later in the conversation with David. The top 10 most expensive players, of course, Neymar and Mbappé, and right after Dembélé, as a consequence of the Neymar deal, of course, Barcelona had to go out and try to look for a replacement. So spending big here. The other thing which we like to analyze is how did the most expensive players perform in a given season. And we can say that most of last year's most expensive players have been playing regularly for their teams, and only Batshuayi and Mkhitaryan from United and Chelsea respectively can be considered players non-profitable, given the investment that has been done on them. So no news, the fact that what happened this summer, again, this is, and we'll have the time even to discuss together how much this activity by PSG has affected the market. Is this something that will change the market forever, the industry forever? What is true is that this summer we've seen 5 transactions that have just joined the top 10, historical top 10 of most expensive players. And again, some of them related to each other. As a result, what we are seeing every year is the biggest transfer of each window is going up and up. And again, last year, more than 100 million euros, everyone, we were all very shocked by the number. Who could have told us that 1 year later that number would be just double, right? And actually almost double twice if we take into account also the Mbappé transaction. So what we are seeing is just because of the need of finding good players, and sometimes the very good players are not for sale or just not affordable, what we have also seen is that the average age of the most expensive players has gone down. So if you look at this slide, over the last years, we've seen that more and more, the most expensive players are also the youngest. Just because, one, they are available or easier to be available, and two, there's a longer period of time to amortize the big investment. We will also talk about this later, but we've seen, I mean, the exit clauses are very common in Spain because they are forced by law into the teams, and they became very popular just because of the Neymar deal, but they've been around for a long time, and the report has basically drawn up those transactions that took place because of basically these clauses being triggered. And again, it's still a big amount of money. Let's go a little bit more into detail into the Premier League while we finalize what I want to explain before we have an open conversation. Again, 16% up in terms of investment, and in terms of who has been most active, the team that has been spending more money has been Manchester City, 244 million euros, followed right after by Chelsea. Here we see Everton as a bit of a surprise. They've been very active, of course, again, with the same theory that I was talking about. They've sold Lukaku for a big amount of money, so they've had available money to invest. We will also talk about Arsenal, and of course, it's not the place where you would expect to see a top team in the Premier League. They were only ninth in terms of investment in new players this summer in the Premier League. So last year we saw 13 teams smashing their record high transfer. This year we have seen yet another 9 teams. So the numbers are big, but again, let's keep in mind that most of the times they are justified because you've been able to collect nice money from an expensive player or from an expensive transaction. The most expensive players in the EPL have been, of course, Lukaku and Morata. And another piece of information which is interesting is the fact that we've seen last year we only had 1 English player that cost more than 20 million euros. This year we had 6. And there's a reason for that, which we will discuss probably later on, and which makes the British or the English players a very valuable currency in the transfer windows. So these are the players that I was talking about. So transfers like Walker, Oxlade, Drinkwater, Keane and Pickford are very expensive transfers of English players for the reasons that I was talking about. Championship, of course, the ambition to go into the money waterfall by championship teams means that they keep on investing more and more. So this summer, we've seen 4 transfers in the championship becoming part of the top 10 most expensive in the tournament. We have also had a look, as we do every year. We started to do this 2 years ago, and we actually presented it here, is the fact that many players, many expensive players, are not necessarily successful. And This year, we've made the calculation that over the last 5 years, 1.4 billion euros have been spent on players which were not regular in their teams, and some of them even left their clubs. So we now keep on looking at this year on year, and from one year to the other, we've seen almost $500 million of worth of players that were just not delivering on what was expected, considering that we are talking players of more than 10 million euros. You normally want these players to be consistent in their teams. So examples of players that just that cost a lot of money and that only last one season or not played enough. So in this list where we have Di Maria when he was at United or Benteke when he was at Liverpool, we could include, because of his cost, we could include Batshuayi, who did not play much for Chelsea last season. So player sales up dramatically versus last year, and if we look at this from a team-by-team perspective, very interesting to see as part of this new habit that I was talking about. Seeing Chelsea as #1 in player sales is not necessarily what you would expect. So this is a bit of a new regime and a situation that is changing. Another interesting situation is not to see Southampton at the top. We've seen in the past that they were very successful selling players or forced to sell players. Now with new Chinese ownership, they have decided that they want to try to keep the best players, and we've seen, of course, the case with Van Dijk, the centre back, that wanted to leave the club and he was never let go. And in the past, I reckon that this would not have been the case. So, as we said, net spending in the Premier League 6% down, and then the last section that I want to cover very quickly is what we do in terms of how the squads have been set up for the new season. And here we analyze many different information, including, for instance, homegrown players. Arsenal is, for the second year in a row, the team in the Premier League that has more homegrown players in the squad. Is that good? Isn't that good? We can discuss later. Another interesting thing which we had seen Chelsea doing in the past and now also Manchester City is the fact that because of players becoming that expensive, there are teams like these two that have decided to take more risks and sign more and more players very young that then they put either in their own club system or in clubs that they have agreements with, in a way that there's a lot of circulation of these players up to a point in which some of them will be good enough to make it to the first team, and some others will just be traded. And this is something which is also an interesting development. And finally, if we analyze the average stability of the squad, and again, knowing that Arsenal have been criticized because of not being active enough probably in the transfer window, what we see is, as a result of that, is that they have the highest average length or duration of players in their team. Is that good news? Is that bad news? It remains to be seen. So this is what I wanted to share with you. The report is much more extensive and it's going to be available. Again, just to summarize, it's been a very rare or very strange transfer window, and obviously everyone has been talking about, is this a bubble, is this sustainable? And I think we have to take into account two very important factors here. PSG, which is kind of a different animal, and that has obviously affected dramatically what happened in the market. And number two is the fact that, yes, there's a lot of money being spent, but yes, there's also the same teams that are spending a lot of money are also making a lot of money from selling players. So as long as that money is flowing from and into the game, I think it should be okay. But we can then have a more detailed conversation with both David and then taking questions from you guys. Thank you very much.
Come take a seat. Thank you very much indeed. We'll give you a little break to catch your breath momentarily. For those of you who are sharing this on the sort of internal messaging system and the ones that you sort of see the messages pop up on screen, thank you for doing so. It's hashtag is Soccerex. It's at Esteve Calzada on Twitter, at Sky Sports David as well. If you want to tag us in, we'd be happy for you to share as much of this as possible, and I think Esteve would be in agreement with that. So as Esteve mentioned, we'll continue this conversation up here on stage. We will also give you the opportunity to ask questions with the roving mics going around the room a little bit later. You mentioned the two significant factors that have really informed this body of work, and congratulations, by the way, that's a hell of a lot of work. But the one that I'm really interested in, of course, PSG is of real focus, but the trading of players becoming standard amongst top teams. Why, and why now?
I guess it has to do with the introduction of financial fair play, and some of these teams sometimes would find ways to get finance, either because of strong shareholders or either because getting access to loans, etc. Now the new system means that, as we know, you have to justify whatever you invest in revenues from the club. So it's not only about selling sponsorship which you cannot negotiate overnight. You cannot dramatically increase overnight season ticket sales. So all of a sudden, and you cannot again call the shareholder and ask him to put more money. So what is it that you do? You trade players, and players are also keen. Often, for different reasons, they are keen on being traded. So the reason for that is, well, at the end of the day, the players is the most valuable product in a club, and should be considered something that can be traded no matter how. But if on top of that you need to basically make your account work, there's no choice for you.
With that in mind, 3 of the biggest transfers in history were made in this window: Neymar, Dembele, and as you mentioned, you're counting Mbappe because there is an obligation to purchase at the end. Is this therefore sustainable? Do you see the level of spending, because of the sales now being increased as well, do you see that carrying on in this vein in future?
I think we need to see what happens with the analysis of PSG. And in principle, it looks difficult for them to be able to justify that they can finance those deals by the normal activity of the club. But as I was saying before, if what is invested is justified by income, it should be no problem. So in the past, you would see chairmen buying players thinking like, I'll pay installments, I'll get a loan, I'll call the city mayor to get some money to help me in. Obviously, that's not happening anymore. So the teams are managed in a much more professional way. So they're not going to be able to spend money that they don't have. Even La Liga, for instance, is scrutinized in the activity by the clubs. So there's a very strict financial control, and they tell you exactly how much you can spend. So if they tell you that you can spend a specific amount, it's because you can really do it. So as long as you sell and generate revenues that justify the investment, it should be okay. Again, we need to set aside PSG, of course.
Well, the other side of the PSG situation, of course, is Barcelona, and they eventually managed to sign Ousmane Dembele, but it took a while. They failed to sign Philippe Coutinho from Liverpool. Why, given that they've got 222 million euros burning a hole in their pocket? Did they find it so hard in the transfer market this summer?
Yes, again, it was a very exceptional situation, and it was not their call to let Neymar go, right? So once that happened, I mean, I guess the question here is whether you could have anticipated that and go and buy players before market would know that you have 222 million euro in your pocket. And yes, when you hear when you listen to the board members that complain about the amount of money that they were asked for some of the players, and they decided to pull off from some of those negotiations. Probably the biggest challenge that Barcelona has, besides the actual Neymar deal or Neymar loss, is the fact that they probably don't have similar players that they could sell in a way that they could afford the amount of money that they are being asked. So if you call a top team, such as Liverpool, that is strong financially, that does not need to sell any players, they will give you a huge amount of money. It should be the other way around with you. So Barcelona found themselves in a situation in which there are 4 or 5 players, which we could call kind of the tier 2, which they were not able to properly sell. And that means that as a top team, you should be able to do big transaction selling when you are asked to pay a lot of money buying. But if we compare, for instance, Real Madrid in tier 2, they have players like Morata that have been transferred for a big amount of money, or other players that they
James Rodriguez,
like
presumably is the same tier 2 bracket.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, with that in mind, do you think that there will be, at some point in the future, that next Luis Figo, that next Michael Laudrup, who goes from Real Madrid to Barcelona? I mean, they did a deal for Theo Hernandez, as you know, an Atletico Madrid player, so that pact that the 2 Madrid clubs not to do business with one another has at least changed a little bit this summer. Could it ever happen between the 2 classical rivals?
I think it can happen. At some point of time, probably not with the current regime in both teams, but I think, I believe it should happen, right? If I mean, it's a team that wants to buy a player and the player wants to go and the other team wants to sell the player, why not? Those examples are very particular ones, and Figo moved directly because of triggering the clause. Laudrup had finished his contract when he went to Real Madrid, so there was no negotiation. So as far as I know, there's no example of a transaction yet which required a negotiation between both teams. What I can tell you for a fact is that each other are checking the release clauses for each of the players.
Well, I mean, that's it, isn't it? I mean, were Real Madrid to offer 300 million euros for a certain Lionel Messi, that would create a very interesting situation. I can't see it happening myself, or at least can't see him moving. Now, let's talk a little bit about Premier League lines that have emerged from your report, Esteve. In the Northwest, where we are in Manchester, same top two net spenders, that's Manchester United and Manchester City, and also Everton and Liverpool, 4th and 5th this year because of the increased spending from those 2 clubs. Is there a real sense of a power shift, certainly as far as the transfer market is concerned, away from London to the Northwest? Do you see it that way?
The numbers say that. Whether that's going to be the case going forward, it remains to be seen. But we've seen Manchester United and Manchester City consistently investing heavily one window after the other. And yes, Liverpool and Everton were very, very strong. Also because they've been, especially the case of Everton, they've been in a position to trade a very important player such as Lukaku. But I guess it also depends on how strong will Arsenal be going forward. We also have Spurs, which is more because of positioning rather than anything else, that they don't jump into the big amount of money, and they keep on producing very valuable players. So if they continue with the same positioning, we should see more Walkers going from Spurs to Manchester City, or going from London into the Northwest.
Yeah, we'll talk about Arsenal in a moment. I think they're a particularly interesting point of focus. What about Manchester City, though? Highest number of players leaving, also, as you mentioned, the largest amount of money spent in this summer window. Does that give you the sense, trying to sort of draw some sort of conclusion from that there's a real sense of revolution, especially under Pep Guardiola, and he's been given the time to really explore and deliver that?
I think there's 2 sets of players that have been brought by Manchester City. Those that were done, or those transactions that were done to deliver immediately in the first team, which we all know about. But then there's many others, which include some names that probably the audience doesn't know about, like young Brazilian players, young Spanish players, etc. So that have been bought to be put into the system of the club, so that they can be grown up and ultimately become a finished product that can make it either for the first team or can be traded afterwards, right? And that's again a consequence of the difficulty to buy players or finished product players at an affordable price. So another way of doing this is just like you can promote your homegrown players and your own academy, you can be more aggressive by signing very young players in a way that even if you get it wrong in 8 or 9 out of 10, the moment you get one that is good enough, it pays for the rest. And we've seen Real Madrid doing something similar in the past. You know, everyone is of course aware of Marco Asensio case, but there's others. So Marco Asensio, Ceballos that has been done from Betis this summer, but there's others that have been done and did not work quite well, right?
But the risk is mitigated and it's spread over all of those transfers, if, as you say, you get the one that does work. Let's talk about Arsenal, though, because I thought it was particularly interesting, Esteve, the notion of the most stable squad. Now, normally, you talk about stability in very positive terms in football because it's a world of continuous flux and that this is something that gives you, I suppose, a semblance of a notion of control when it's a very difficult market that's constantly changing. However, players staying on average 3.8 years. Arsenal have a current issue with players being in danger of running down their contracts. We've seen, Alexis Sanchez is not too far away, Mesut Ozil not too far away, Petr Cech not too far away, Oxlade-Chamberlain, we know he moved in the final year of his contract to Liverpool and they got decent money for him, but he did get that close. Is that a result of their management of player trading, which hasn't really particularly been that impressive, and actually the players holding power at Arsenal a little bit more?
I think we should analyze each case separately, and I don't think this is something that comes from a specific strategy by the club. I think they found themselves in this situation. Of course, they are not stupid, and they've been trying to renew both Sanchez and Ozil, and even Oxlade for a long time, right? So I guess the key question here is how successful the team is on the pitch, because players want to be good players, want to be in teams that compete for the trophies and play Champions League regularly, right? Because those numbers, when we used to do the report at the beginning, we would see Barcelona showing up #1 in terms of homegrown players, #1 in terms of stability. That combined with great results on the pitch, you would say this is fantastic. In normal circumstances, we could say the same about Arsenal: stability, young players into the first team. And no matter what we analyze from Arsenal, like, we see them being 9th in terms of expenditure. Someone could say that's good because they don't need to buy, right? And
tell Arsenal fans that.
Exactly.
So they'll agree.
And of course, it doesn't work out because the team is not delivering.
Is it to do with the image then of Arsenal as a club who are not readily associated with success anymore? Yes, there's winning the FA Cup, but that's, I think most Premier League teams would agree, relatively low on the list of priorities of all the silverware you could win. So is it more to do with that? The big name players aren't coming because Arsenal is not seen as a team that is as readily successful as your Manchester Cities, as your Manchester Uniteds, as your Chelseas, etc.
I think there's definitely something in that for sure, and we know that Arsenal tried to do Lemar deal at the very end of the window, and they had the downside that they were not playing the Champions League, right? So that's definitely a limitation. However, Arsenal has the potential to stay at the top and to be still it's a very strong proposition, a very strong established brand in English football, and they should be in a position to be successful again soon because they have the same revenue generation capacity than any other top team in the Premier League.
I mean, as we heard in our opening ceremony from Duncan Reevy, that little clip of him saying, it's about negotiations, it's about business, it's about et cetera, but it always comes back to football on the pitch. I find it really interesting at this moment that football fans are judging their team on the strength of their transfer windows, and that in itself is its own metric of success. So there'll be Arsenal fans who'll be looking at the failure to get Thomas Lemar on deadline day and therefore to let Alexis Sanchez go to Manchester City, as a failure. They almost have their own Premier League table of transfer window success. Is that something that you're seeing anecdotally in conversations with people when you produce a report like this?
Not really. I think that it's also it's also something that, of course, the media push for, because the headlines is transfer activity. You know, I mean, it's not about a decline or net spending being down. So there's news that generate headlines and attraction and generate audience, and some others that don't, right? So I don't think that's necessarily the case.
Okay, just my conversations then. That's fine. What about the waste of Premier League signings? This is a really interesting development, isn't it? It's not just so much that it's a huge amount of money, but it's a fact that that huge amount of money has gone up from 950 million euros over 4 years to almost 1.4 billion over 5 years. It's a big jump in one single year. What do you put that down to? Is it clubs being more adventurous in the transfer market, perhaps?
Yeah, and the actual 1.4 billion euro number is staggering on its own.
Yeah.
And the trend for the last season, of course, is confirming that. And yeah, I think that the explanation for that is, first of all, disposable income. So you've got the money and you try things, and the risk of getting it wrong is not that big, right? In the past, if you would be Sevilla, or you should be careful. I mean, Sevilla could not make a big investment and get it wrong, right? Here, as there's more disposable income, there's more propensity to take risks, and then of course, as a consequence of top talent not being necessarily available, there's a lot of deals which are 10, 15, 20, 25 million euros that are done just to see, let's see what happens. I can afford it, and if I'm successful, I have produced a player that I may be able to sell for a bigger price later on.
There are a number of players who have moved in that bracket of prices you just mentioned, 20, 25, 30, particularly English players. And as you mentioned in your presentation, Esteve, 6 English players moved for £20 million or more to other Premier League clubs. Last summer it was just John Stones who moved from Everton to Manchester City. Again, is there a premium on English players? Is it to do with the homegrown quota? What is that down to?
Yeah, there's a premium, and actually I think this is a disadvantage of the Premier League compared to the other leagues. On top of the restrictions to bring in here non-European players that are more strict than the ones that you can find in the other leagues, as we know, there's an obligation of having 8 homegrown players in your squad in England, and that's defined by having been 3 years consecutively in an English club below 21 years old. So I know for a fact that many teams will have found themselves in a situation that they were counting.
Well, Manchester City had it a couple of years ago, did they not?
Yeah, could be. And some others are doing the transactions thinking, oh my God, I'm just surpassing the number and I need 8, right? So those players are definitely high currency for the top teams, because it cannot be any player. You're not going to bring to a team of this caliber a player just because he has an English passport. He needs to be good enough. So when a good enough player comes up and has the English passport, then he's highly demanded, and that's why the price gets inflated.
What about buyout clauses? We mentioned Neymar, of course, and the most famous buyout clause. I think that's really when it penetrated into the general consciousness amongst general football fans here, the notion of a buyout clause. And in fact, the rules governing them, it's a law in Spain, as we were discussing earlier, but it doesn't really prevail in the other European leagues as a major factor. However, we've seen top dollar paid for Neymar, 222 million euros. Cristiano Ronaldo's buyout clause is 1 billion euros. Do we think that the days of putting a buyout clause prohibitively high as a deterrent are gone because clubs are willing to pay them, and that as a result, 300 million euros for Lionel Messi, as Pep Guardiola was saying recently, someone could come and offer that, and that's actually much more in the realms of reality now than it used to be. Would that be fair?
We need to see what happens because, again, this summer we have seen this exceptional transaction, and many times these clauses are either prohibitive, like the one from Cristiano Ronaldo, which is to say clearly he's not up for sale.
It would be very difficult to prove FFP, wouldn't it? I think if you spent €1 billion on
that's the thing. But then 222 million euros, it's an amount which makes you doubt whether, like, is it an amount that is a tag like it's not for sale, or it's an amount that is big enough to justify it locally in front of your fans, but in a way that you couldn't do anything and someone came and paid for it. In some cases, these clauses also dictate the price. So for instance, Theo, that was brought from Atletico to Real Madrid, the clause indicated the amount. And then what happens is that when sometimes the teams sit down and agree a deal rather than provoking a hostility by basically stealing a player from each other. And sometimes now it has changed, but in the past it would be good to sit down because for the same amount you could have some tax benefits if you would do it as a proper transfer as opposed to just triggering the clause.
Right, okay. And actually, let's just have one last question really on La Liga, because we've mentioned Barcelona, we've talked a little bit about Real Madrid, but aside those clubs, one interesting thing that I noticed from your presentation was the percentage that the top four were responsible for in terms of overall spending. So aside Dembele and Paulinho to Barcelona, aside Ceballos and Theo Hernandez, as you mentioned, they're only responsible for 60% of the spending, which is down again. Why is that? Is that because Real Madrid's supposed Galactico policy has now sort of faded slightly, or is it that other teams are really going for it a little bit more?
Well, first of all, it's still a big number, but if we consider that we're coming from 75–80%, is a significant decrease, and this is actually the outcome of the policy of La Liga in terms of centralizing the TV rights revenues and trying to have more democracy in terms of the way those revenues are spread among the teams. So over the last 2 years, we've seen the situation change, and we've seen it in numbers, both in terms of teams being able to retain talent that they could never retain in the past, just because smaller teams have more disposable income. So that means that they can spend more and sometimes overspend Barcelona and Real Madrid, also sometimes because they've been able to sell players. But when you analyze the numbers, you can see, for instance, that newly promoted teams have invested 25 million euros in new players this summer in La Liga. That would be unimaginable 3–4 years ago. I mean, if Almeria would promote to La Liga, they would create the squad by trying to get loans from different teams, and they would hardly spend a couple of million euros.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I mean, Alaves did it last year. They very much followed that type of project, if you like, trying to loan players, and they reached the Copa del Rey final for the first time. So I guess that's one way of trying to make it work. Okay, we've covered a lot up here on stage, but now it's time to hand it over to you guys. So if you have a question for Esteve, please raise your hand, and we'll get a roving mic to you. Katie, there's one just here on the right-hand side as I look, just in the middle of the audience. If you could say your name and where you're from as well before your question, that would be great. Thank you.
My name is Murtala. I'm from Lagos, Nigeria. Thank you so much for your presentation. I was just wondering if, firstly, foreign investment has, I don't know if I missed it, but if foreign investments in the clubs have resulted in the increase of transfers and in terms of their spend. And touching on sustainability of the transfers, do you think, touching on issue on sustainability, do you think that in future there might be a situation where the UEFA needs to put a spending cap for teams? For instance, with the PSG situation, say a club shouldn't spend more than $500 million a year, just because obviously there are a lot of consequences from the spend, from the sale of and purchase of a player like Neymar, for Barcelona and the rest of the European clubs, yeah.
Okay, so two-part question there for foreign ownership and its impact on transfers first, Esteve.
There's been, of course, the La Liga clubs besides the Barcelonas and Real Madrid have become more attractive to foreign investors, and there's been new investors coming in. But as far as we have seen so far, there's no examples of new investors spending a lot of money on their arrival. Also, because there is a financial control in there, right? So La Liga sets the amount that you can spend, right? And even new investors like the Chinese one that there is in Espanyol, and even if they would like to invest more, they also have restrictions in their home country that they cannot spend as much as they would like. So we haven't seen any example of, I mean, it's not happening anymore that an investor comes and does crazy things, you know. Now, yes, of course, you can buy a football club because of wanting some popularity or wanting to have some fun, but I guess no one is happy to lose money over time, right? So what we are seeing more and more is that anyone buying a football club expects a return. So you will not see the money thrown away just like that. As for the second question, we don't call it salary cap, but there is some sort of cap in principle. So the financial fair play has been created to basically tackle that, right? The cap is set by your ability to generate revenues through the normal streams in the club, right? And we are all, of course, anxious to see what happens out of this investigation, after this investigation to PSG, because we are all very interested to see how will they explain, how is it justified in income, this amount of money that is being invested in these players. But of course, if there's no resolution or nothing happens out of this, there needs to be a change, because the perception in the industry is that there's no way to match those numbers, and there's no way to finance those deals with the activity of the club.
Okay, thank you for your question. Who is next? Just here on the right as well. Thanks very much.
Hi, my name is Ben. I come from Sweden. Thank you very much for the presentation as well. I was just wondering, you talked about Manchester City and the way that they have this season bought players to come straight into the first team. And quite a lot in the Premier League, there's a high buying players to produce results straight away. There's this incredible competition between teams in the Premier League to either get Champions League places because of the financial benefits it will give teams, or even with teams that are lower down in the league, buying players that can come in straight away to stop them from getting relegated and losing the money in that way. Do you see this as a potential problem actually for youth development within the Premier League? This fact that teams are trying to buy the best players to handle the demands of the Premier League and keep them there, and therefore players aren't being allowed the opportunity to come through the youth systems because there is this high demand to buy the best players to keep their team in the short-term future in the situation that they're currently in?
Yes, there's a threat there for sure. There's a threat because again, then a manager is not necessarily paid or rewarded because of fielding more homegrown players, but he's rewarded for winning, right? And unless the players he has in the system or in the academy or in the EDS team are very, very good, normally he will try to ignore those players, and that's why it becomes more difficult to see them straight into the first team when you talk about this top team, the Cities, the Uniteds, the Chelseas, etc. Actually, both Chelsea and City are now the best in the country in terms of winning the youth competitions. Basically, they win it all. The FA Cup, Under-18, the Under-20 Premier League, everything is won by these two teams. There's other teams which can afford, I mean, their description of success is not necessarily winning trophies. And for those teams, I believe we still see a situation in which they will keep on producing players that they will be able to field in their own teams. But up to a point, even if they go into the first team, once they are there, there's going to be still the risk of those being stolen by the top teams. However, every single Premier League team now is quite strong financially. So none of them is really desperate to sell. And of course, here we are analyzing the deals that did happen. But maybe one day we need to do the opposite, analyze the deals that did not happen, because there's plenty of them too.
Yeah, it's much to our frustration on Sky Sports on deadline day, by the way, obviously. Actually, can I just follow on from Ben's question, because I think you raised a good point, Ben, and you touched on it in your presentation, actually, Esteve. How much does spending, and especially concentrated spending in one window, the likes of a Manchester City or a PSG, how much does that equate to trophy-driven success? As you say, there's lots of different ways of measuring success, but that's the most common one, I guess. We saw a slide that you showed where there were the sort of really big spends of a window and like the top 10 of those. And I think I only saw Real Madrid winning the Champions League in 2014. And I think it was Juve winning Serie A in 2002, which would suggest that actually one big spend in one big splurge doesn't necessarily equate to success. So what is the key? Is it more consistency with that method?
I wish I would have the key, right? with this amount of money that we're talking about. I guess that if possible, because let's not forget that sometimes there's the pressure of the owner, the pressure of the fans to win. So every executive in a club would like to ask for time, Give us some time and we will deliver. But there's always this short-term pressure to win. And that's why sometimes you tend to spend a lot in one window, but then you cannot continue the same way the following window, just because you cannot afford it every window, right? So ideally, and I think that the top positions will be for those teams that can do consistent investment in teams, in new players, even if it's not necessarily always the biggest amount, but by definition, if you bring 10 players in one season, or 6 or 7, and not, even if all of those are expensive, you will always get players wrong. It's impossible to always get it right. So if you just concentrate the risk in one season, then it's more difficult. So you ideally, because there's not, you don't always have the choice. It also depends on how much money you have available. All of a sudden you find yourself that, like it happened with Spurs 4 or 5 years ago. They found themselves with 100 million euros from Bale. Mm-hmm. And then they did spend them, but most of players that came then are not anymore in the team, right? So it depends, but if I were to choose, or if I were to kind of predict what can happen, I guess the success will be for those teams that are in a position to do it consistently
and in a sort of measured fashion, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great, thank you. Right, we've got time for a couple more. Please put your hand up if you'd like to ask Esteve a question, or are we done? Let's have a look. Just glancing across. There's one lady just behind. Sorry, Ben. There's one just behind Ben there. Thank you, Katie. Hi there.
Yeah, hi, my name is Stephanie. I'm from Switzerland. What do you think how do you see the role of hedge funds and financial institutions in the current market and going forward in supporting big clubs? And
sorry,
how would this
can you just repeat that? I didn't hear it myself. How do you see the role of
hedge funds and financial institutions in support of this top dollar business in football? And how would you think that this could affect the market in creating a competitive edge or creating exclusivity, which might be frowned upon?
Well, just like I was mentioning earlier, there's a lot of examples in which it's proven that investing in football can have a traditional financial return, right? So normally this should attract traditional financial institutions into the game. There's been a period of time in which these institutions would probably use this money for buying player rights which was then banned by FIFA, of course. So the third-party ownership is of course forbidden. But in the past, there would be money like that. You know, I want to buy 20% of this player, 25% of this player. With that not being possible anymore, I think there's a space for two different types of transactions by this type of institutions. In one sense is to, and in primetime sport, we have done some deals in this direction. It's like securing some of the insured revenues that the club will have. If you have, you know, sold a player for 50 million and that's, you know, 5 installments of 10 million, if the buying club is strong enough, you can secure that money and an institution can give it to you in exchange of an interest rate. That's one way, or just like, you know, we all know that the TV revenues are solid revenues for the clubs, and that's also a way that you know, these financial institutions, you know, if a club needs to do a new stadium and has contracts that say that will make 150 million euros over the next 3 years, and they need the money now, even if it's meant to be collected over a period of time, there's a role there, as long as those contracts are secure enough for the financial institution, or as long as the financial institution decides the risk equation, right? So if that's not safe enough, maybe I charge a higher interest rate. So that's one way. The other way, it's linked to the actual acquisition of football clubs, right? Which can be profitable. We've seen examples of clubs being bought at one price in a given time and being sold 3 years later at 5 times the price, right? So if you've been one of the investors in that club and you've put, you know, you have had the right management team and the right entrepreneurs behind it, that can also be a very profitable activity.
Okay, thank you for your question, Stephanie. We've got one more here? We have, okay. This will be the final one, I'm afraid, guys. Thank you. Just here on the left-hand side.
Hi, I'm Jed, I'm from Miami. Question about La Liga. With the new distribution rights model, how long will it be before we see a more competitive top 5, top 10, as opposed to that usual top 2 or 3?
I think it has become to be more competitive. It depends. I mean, you have Barcelona and Real Madrid, that's very difficult to change. But we have started to see at least Barcelona and Real Madrid losing games, which could not happen in the past. And that's already a change. And we have also started to see, I mean, a couple of years ago, Atletico was there for La Liga. You know, no one questions that Atletico now can be a good contender. And while it's still difficult that we see a champion soon that is not Barcelona or Real, what is a fact is that since this new income has come into the other teams, they are definitely more competitive. So they are bringing in better players. They can invest in transfers rather than just using loans. And more importantly, they can find themselves winning the top teams more often than it used to be in the past. In the past, we would see Barcelona or Real win La Liga with 100 points, you know, or even more. That I don't think is going to happen anymore. And we have already seen, even if they are so strong, Real has already dropped a couple of points. In the second match, Barcelona dropped more points than ever last season, but they were still competing for La Liga until the very end. So I think it has become already more competitive, but probably not enough to see Barcelona, neither Barcelona or Real winning. But we'll still see some teams, Sevilla, Villarreal, Valencia, very, very successful and being able to Sevilla, for instance, last season, you know it well, you do the program, were there. I mean,
yeah, until January, really. Yeah. Well, they were the first team to beat Real Madrid, weren't they, in La Liga?
Exactly.
And their unbeaten run.
So that would never happen 3-4 years ago, and it has started to happen.
Great. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your questions. Esteve has one brief media commitment after this, but I'm sure that, as he mentioned, you'd be around for a few one-on-ones if anyone has any private questions they want to ask him. But once again, please join me in thanking the CEO of Primetime Sport, Esteve Calzada.
Thank you.